Hello everyone, it's Mr. G coming at you with another Misconceptions in History, and we are doing a part 2 of submarines. Today we're going to be looking at submarines in World War I, the interwar period, and World War II. I just want to preface this that I know I'm not going to hit every submarine that was developed during this time period because we are literally talking about dozens and dozens of different designs at this time frame. So I'm just going to try to hit some of the bigger ones and the ones that advance technology. So obviously if I'm going to talk about World War I and submarines, the thing that should come to mind was unrestricted submarine warfare that occurred during this war. However, that is just a small fraction of what happened with submarines during this time frame. So all the major powers at this time were actually developing submarines, and obviously this was still early stages, experimental, but they were all deploying submarines in some capacity. Now, the forerunners of this were the British with their A through D class. And honestly, the A, B, and C class submarines were really nothing special. They were extremely problematic for the British. They were more like a test bed for what would succeed, and what really did succeed for them was the D class. This class was the first one to use 2 screws for propulsion. It had better maneuverability, better speed, better endurance, and it actually deployed something known as a saddle tank. Now, what's so important about saddle tanks is this actually changed how they did the ballast on the submarine to allow it to sink, balance, things like that. They moved them basically from the top of the submarine to the sides, allowing them to have better balance on the submarine, better for waves, things like that, speed, allowed for more aerodynamics. And this would revolutionize submarine design, and the design was actually used on multiple submarines throughout the world, even until the end of World War II. Now, another odd development by the British was actually a steam-powered submarine, and by that I mean it used oil-fired boilers to power the submarine. The design was pretty much abandoned by the end of World War I. Now, the more obvious and better successful design came from the Kaiserliche Marine, which was the German U-1 and U-series boats, the predecessor to what we think of as a U-boat that the Germans would use during World War II. Now, these went through a series of designs, each more progressive, and they actually built hundreds of different submarines, and the way their design was basically every couple of submarines would just be an improvement on the last few. And this would all culminate into the last series, and I used the U-51 for example here, which these were long-range cruiser-type submarines designed for extended service, heavy-duty operations. The next major contributor to submarine warfare during World War I would be the French, and the French actually had 5 main classes of submarines that they built, and each one of these actually had multiple subclasses. So the French actually designed multiple submarines based off of these 5, and they ended up with dozens and dozens of different designs. And like the Germans, these were just progressive designs. Each one was an improvement upon the previous generation, and the subclasses were improvements upon the others. And the final power to really develop submarines during this time frame would actually be the United States. And the United States was actually behind. A lot of their designs were based off the British. This was actually a common theme before the interwar period. The British would design some type of new ship, like we see with the Dreadnought class battleships, and the United States would basically copy it and try to make their improvements upon it. Now, of course, World War I would end, the Treaty of Versailles would end it, but actually what came afterwards would be the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. And this is actually during a time period where there were multiple treaties designed to limit arms, as the world felt that another arms race would lead to another world war. But as it was believed that navies would be the main weapon of the next major war, they basically decided to limit its power. And the United States actually led the initiative, and the idea was to take every major power and limit their naval capabilities. However, the 2 least affected items of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 were aircraft carriers and submarines. As aircraft carriers were basically a brand new idea and still experimental, they really weren't seen as a threat yet. And submarines, while extremely hated by multiple nations, including the British, who wanted to ban submarine warfare altogether, were still seen as kind of a novelty, even though the Germans had absolutely wrecked Atlantic shipping during this time frame. They were basically seen as something they felt was going to eventually go away because it wasn't considered civilized. But that doesn't mean people stopped designing submarines. Now, the United States would take advantage of the Washington Naval Treaty to basically finish developing their S-class, which would lead them to the V-boats. Now, the V-boats are actually 9 submarines that are divided into 5 classes. Each class had a different purpose. Now, the last 3, 7, 8, and 9 are actually the most important, because every World War II submarine, from the Tambor class to the Tench class, is based off of the V7 through 9 series. The French also took this time to develop a series of large, ocean-going submarines that were basically for patrol purposes. However, they did develop one unusual submarine. Now, the Surkov is actually a cruiser-type submarine, and this means that it was actually a mixture of a cruiser ship and a submarine, and it carried a pair of 8-inch guns and a full battery of anti-aircraft weapons. Now, the British actually did a little bit of development, but a lot of theirs was on their smaller classes, like the British L class, and that would become the basis for all their future fleet as well. Now, as the Germans had their hands tied by the Washington Naval Treaty and other armistice treaties and weren't allowed to develop submarines, they actually kind of got around it. They created a dummy corporation that allowed them to build this Spanish submarine based on their designs, which would become the German Type 1. Now, this design would also be used to create the Soviet S class, their first main submarine. Now, the Japanese actually got German submarines as part of reparations from World War I, but they actually developed their own series of smaller, lighter submarines that they would utilize during development in the interwar period. Now, of course, by the time we get to actually World War II, many nations have actually started to build full fleets. This is where we're going to see the German U-boats start to emerge, like the Type 1, 2, the Type 9, which would become the basis for all future Germans. And when we think of a U-boat, you're probably going to be picturing a Type 9 or some descendant of the Type 9. It is the Type 9 and the boats that were based off of the Type 9 that would basically wreck the Atlantic and would force the United States and its allies to develop new tactics to take them on. The British would invest their time in their U-class, but actually more importantly, this would lead to their own British V-class submarine that utilizes that saddlebag hull and would become the workhorse of the British Empire during World War II. Now, the three main workhorses of the American Navy and their submarine fleet, the Gato, Balao, and Tench Class, were actually improvements upon each other. The Balao being an improvement over the Gato, and the Tench being an improvement over the Balao Class. And the designs on these submarines were so good that the Gato got retired in '69, and there are still Balao and Tench classes in the world still being serviced and used. Now, the Japanese did the most interesting things with submarines, and it makes sense. An island country would utilize submarines in the most unusual ways. And so they actually developed a series. They developed strictly transportation. They developed refueling submarines. Now, probably the most interesting one is the I-400 series. Now, when the I-400s were completed, they were the largest submarines in the world and would remain so until ballistic missile submarines would come about. Now, these submarines were so large because of the fact that they were aircraft carriers. They carried three amphibious airplanes on board that were designed for long-range attacks. And in fact, the plan for these, once they were built, was actually to attack the United States and its allies and damage their infrastructure. Now, in addition to the three aircraft they carried on board, they actually had 8 forward-launching torpedo tubes and a 14-centimeter cannon on board. So they were designed for total destruction. Now, the Japanese actually only managed to launch 2 of them. They did build 3 of them out of the original 18 that were planned, but as the war raged on, they just consumed too much material to keep building these. Now, what they tried to replace them with was the I-201, and these were just high-speed, highly maneuverable submarines that were designed to just wreak destruction on the incoming American fleets and just do as much damage as possible. And the Japanese actually only managed to complete 3 of the intended 23 of these submarines before the war ended. And these actually could have done some serious damage, as they actually had radar, sonar. They could actually detect when a death charge was coming in and where it would hit, so they could actually avoid it. They would have been beasts had it not been for the fact that they just ran out of the materials necessary to make them. So there you have it, just a real quick, brief look at submarines from World War I to World War II. I know I missed some, and I'm sorry if I missed some of your favorites or some of the more unusual ones that you like. I know I missed talking about the fact that the Germans tried to create a missile-carrying submarine, or, more about the I-400, which I'd love to do more in the future and hopefully will. But I do thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to talking to you all the next time.